And welcome to the ICTNWK401 Install and Manage a Server. So as discussed on our last week of term, we will be using Windows Server 2019 with referencing going to Server World for our external tutorials for content, because what's in my learning is written for 2008. So to get the current command structures, refer to that external Server World site for that. So basically we'll be covering the skills and knowledge to manage a server, which includes configuring it, ongoing administration, profiling and monitoring the servers, troubleshooting techniques like everything else. We have 4 sessions, and within those sessions we'll be covering both theory and practical, just like every other class, and you will be required to do quite a bit out of hours, as this is now fully remote. Again, hit me up on Discord, or if you need extra time face to face, we can arrange another BlueJeans session. So quick recap, what's a server? Okay, so basically just a specialist computer that offers services to other computers and forms a server client or master slave type relationship, if you like. And these services are generally performed on the server rather than on the client, thus a remote service. So what's the purpose of having servers? It provides centralized resources for clients and frees up resources in the company, so they don't have to keep replicating those resources in every location, and you can maximize the processing power, memory and storage in these centralized locations, making backup and disaster recovery processes much easier to implement and maintain for the enterprise. So as you'd be aware, there are many different types of servers: web servers, emails, applications, database, domain name servers, file storage, and I'm sure you could think of a few extras. All right, so gaming, all those things. I mean, would gaming come under applications? One could argue, I don't know. So servers with any just a dedicated machine, so they will run a dedicated operating system, be it Linux, Microsoft or Apple, and the choice comes down to the business requirements and their budget, like everything else in business. But most common servers will be either Microsoft or Linux based. Microsoft is still by far the most common out there. Linux is gaining ground quickly. So where can you get a copy of Windows Server 2019? You can go to Microsoft Evaluation Windows Server 2019 and download the ISO file, which is about 5 gigabytes, not gigabits, in size, and then download and install it on a VM platform such as VM Player. So whatever works on your machine just use that. We'll be using I'll be now using VM Player versions 15. I did a few upgrades on my Windows 10 and now required it had to be upgraded because I'm now running the 2004 WinVar, which has inbuilt native Linux support in it. So that's going to be interesting to explore as well. So I can actually use it in native mode. I can actually load like Kali Linux natively as an application, download it out of the App Store. It's going to be an interesting learning exercise for me. So the next time we do virtual machines for the next group, I can do containers and that natively in Windows 10. So external tutorial site, as I said, Server World will be the main site, and the activity sheets and that I'm developing all reference that site. And basically what I'm doing is creating a local document so that people can just have that as a reference file rather than flicking back and forth between the website and that. They can just print out the document. Now, each operating system will have different requirements, just like a normal PC. And if you do a little search, you'll find that the Microsoft site, they actually have documents listing the requirements for each version of the server software. So we need a 64-bit processor with at least 1.4 gigahertz in clock speed, and basically gives you a list of things that must be there. And most modern, like the i7 processors, i5 processors and that will all be there. Minimum memory 512 megabytes, but as usual, the lower the RAM, the less functionality you will have, and the lower the performance. You have to have 2 gigabytes of RAM if you want to have a GUI desktop for 2019, otherwise you're just command lining. The memory needs to be error correcting code, ECC type, for physical, not a requirement if you're doing virtual machines. What you will need to do is increase your RAM capacity in your virtual machine, because if you try to create a virtual machine with 512 megabytes, it will fail. Storage, minimum 32 gigabytes. Okay, I recommend at least 80 gigabytes and setting up a second partition within that. Just to separate your storage functionality and things like that from the operating system. So, as I said, your VM installation basically need at least one processor core dedicated to the VM. You need to increase your RAM to at least 800 megabytes, of RAM. Now, if you just do it to 2 gig or 4 gig, depending on what you've got available, if you want that GUI interface, you're going to set it to a minimum of 2 gigabyte of RAM, so you're not going to have issues with that. So you just need to make the choice whether you allocate more RAM to the virtual machine or go through and set up a dedicated pathing for your page file which is a little bit more complicated. It's much easier just to allocate the RAM and move on. Now, I have created a Windows 2019 installation video for this activity on how to install. Now, the video is about 13 or 15 minutes long, and I skip a lot of the waiting time. So I think it took about 20 to 25 minutes to actually set up the virtual machine. That will vary depending on your machine and how much RAM and processors you've allocated to the virtual machine. Okay, so to create that, you will need a host machine, a VMware player or equivalent virtual machine software, and the Windows Server 2019 ISO file to install onto that virtual machine. And just like every good, I've lost my cursor. There we go. Where art thou? So, like all good, I've got it preloaded and set up, ready to go. So if you need to go over the videos again, I'll upload them to the usual YouTube channel and post the links up in Discord for that again. So cast your mind back to that subject, business requirements. So again, setting up a server will be part of a business requirements document, outlining what you've got to do, and you'll be assigned the task of setting up the installation and working out the parameters and things like that. So if you are assigned the task from a business perspective, we basically need to just go through the requirements of the business, making sure that the server is set up to meet the requirements for the business, and some of the things you need to consider before proceeding is which operating system you're going to use, which features are you going to set up, what applications you need to install on the server. Do you need to back up and restore existing data? In other words, are you replacing an existing server? Do you need to transfer that data across? So that's your data migration plan comes into play there. Make sure the system resources are available to make that all happen, and evaluate whether the existing hardware is capable of taking on the new system requirements, or whether you need to purchase new hardware to meet those project requirements. And you're going, yeah, we've done this unit before. Yeah, well, guess what? It is part of the assessments for you to go through and evaluate business requirements and write a business plan or an action plan on how you're going to meet those requirements. So again, work plan, arrange access to the site, check for any health hazards, complete all your documentation and processes according to company's policies and procedures, and develop a deployment plan which steps out how you're going to deploy the software and the hardware, which timing So are you doing it during business hours, after hours? What services will be impacted by this deployment? And critical of that is any downtime to the business. Some businesses are quite happy working standard business hours, so you doing the work after hours causes no downtime to the business, but some businesses work extended hours or are a 24/7 business, so you need to work out which is the best time with the minimal impact on the business. You also need to make sure you have a rollback process, so if you can't complete the deployment, in other words, something's gone wrong and you can't stand it up within the window, you need to have a process to roll it back so the business can continue, and you go back and reschedule another window so that after you work out what went wrong and resolve those issues, to come back and deploy again. Establish your testing parameters and take some benchmarks before and after installation, so you can prove in the reporting that the installation has been successful and delivered the performance increase or whatever has been sold as part of the project for this deployment. Then you need to clean up and restore the environment, document all your server configurations, operational changes, requirements, any reporting requirements that have been laid out, and then get the final sign-off and acceptance by the client, whether that client be your manager or an external client. All right, so that's the business side of things. So when we have installed it, there's only the default administrator account. Now, should you keep that account as administrator? No. Simple as that. Okay? The idea of accounts is twofold. You have a name for the account and a password. A default account eliminates half of the workload for any hacker. They already know that account exists, so they only have to get the password. So half of the hacking requirements are resolved if you keep the default account. So it's recommended that you change the administrator account to something else, just so that they have another level of process to go through to break in. Should you change the privilege level of account? Well, that's debatable. Some people say you should change it. Some people say not to. So that there's a debate on whether you should change the privilege level. But as a general rule, it's probably best to modify that or just change the name of it, because you want to maximize the time that it will take for a hacker to break in. Okay? You should always create a new account for yourself, okay, and give that admin level privileges, okay? You shouldn't actively use any default accounts. When the server sets up, it has a randomly generated name, and that's not very useful to you overall. Okay, so it comes up with some random thing. Now, computer names are usable for searching and defining what's going on. So you kind of need to change that name to something that complies with the naming conventions within the company. And you can change this within the system properties and add those things to domain memberships and work groups and all this sort of stuff. So the actual computer name has quite a lot of impact on some of the features that we want to use as a server. Once you've done those changes, you will be more than likely requested to do a reboot to make those changes come into effect. All right. We will then need to set up the server IP address. So being a server, we should manually set the IP. We shouldn't have it just randomly changing. Why would we want to have a static address on a server? So services can be found basically. Okay, so this can be accessed via the Ethernet section in the local server pane. I can't talk today. So go in there, change the IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, and the DNS server addresses. Next, just like any product, you'll need to set up how you want Windows to update, whether they will be automatically updated or a combination of notifications. I'll download it and notify you when the updates are ready, whatever it is. There are 4 options available for you to select from. Select the one that complies with the requirements of your business. Okay. Local group policy editor can be accessed with gpedit.msc from the command line to make those changes, and these will be outlined within the activities. Next, we want to change the default settings on the firewalls. Firewall by default will not allow echo or the ping command to function. So we need to turn on the ICMP, allow ICMP to enter through the firewall. And we do this under the tools menu and adjust the inbound firewall policy. All of these will be covered in the activities. So we'll go through demos on that. Date and time settings. When you set up the server, it is a workgroup server and it is set up to use an NTP client by default, and it will sync to time.windows.com, which is the default Microsoft NTP server, and it will come up with a date and time. Now, according to this, it's the 13th of July at 4:35 p.m. Now, looking at my clock, it's the 14th of July and it's 9:35 a.m. So we need to change the region that is being used by the server, okay, because it defaults to a US region. We need to change it to our local region so that the time difference is made between the server and our local machine. And this is what we will be doing as the activity for today, is setting up the initial settings. So we'll be going through setting up the new user account and set it with admin privilege levels, changing the computer name, setting the IP address of the server, setting the update processes, and adjusting the region clock to make it all work. Okay, so now there's about another 10 slides to this presentation, and the question I will throw to you is, do you want to just have the presentation and then go through the activities as a separate set of videos and so forth after the PowerPoint's finished? Your feedback is now required. Let's see if anybody's awake. Oh no, I sent them all to sleep. Alright. Oh, Charles, you're the only one that's replied with a when to have it, so cheers to you. We'll do it after the PowerPoint. Alright, so I haven't recorded this initial settings video. I have recorded the installation video already. So we'll do that when we're stepping through it as a process after the PowerPoint. So in that case, we'll finish the PowerPoint off and then take a break and then come back and do the activities. Alright, because there's another activity which goes through changing the NTP server and a few other points. So it's all good. Okay, so you can set it up if you're just leaving your servers in a work group. I would suggest changing one of the servers to be an NTP server, which all the other workgroup computers will join and get their time synchronized from that. Now, Network Time Protocol was developed in 1981, uses TCP/IP protocol suite to deliver basically a synchronization signal containing the time. So NTP uses the universal time, so coordinated UTC, to synchronize clocks, and it does not take into account time zones. Thus, that discrepancy between my virtual machine and the actual time of today. So we need to set the local machine up to perform that time zone calculation, and that's what we'll be doing in the next one. Now, how the time servers work is there's basically a tree of servers, and these are called stratum levels. So as you come down from the source, it changes the stratum level. So a stratum 0 receives the time from a dedicated transmitter or satellite navigation system. So it's directly connected to one of the main clocks that are around the world. If, as you come down and your computer links to a stratum-0 machine, it is a stratum-1. Stratum-2 receives its time synchronization from a stratum-1. Rinse and repeat. All right. So the further down the stratum tree you are, the accuracy of your clock is slightly out, because you're getting further away from the original source of the time. So there is mechanisms within NTP to adjust for the round trip time and things like that. But again, delays in processing and all that, they just add together, just minor increment shifts, and your clocks get skewed just slightly as they go through the stratum levels. Why is it important that we synchronize clocks throughout all our devices in the network? Mainly for auditing. Okay, so we need to have an accurate timestamp on everything that we occur within our systems, so that we can have coordinated procedures and sequences that happen in the correct sequence. Security, all right. If you don't have an accurate timestamp on security logs and footage and things like that, it becomes very hard to confirm when things occurred, and it makes it impossible to prosecute because the timestamps don't align. Basically, it gives the bad people a way out, right? The updates are carried out depending on the timers, and that's one of the things you'll see when we set the updates. You can schedule updates to occur at a certain time, so you need to have your computers all synced. My door's closed, so I don't get visits from our two cats, so it's all right, Jacob. I totally relate. Computers are warm, cats want to get warmth. Okay, and the fact that you're paying the computer attention and not them really upsets them. You know, the Egyptians, they worshipped them as gods, and the cats have never forgotten that. They believe we all should still continue to worship. All right. I'm a cat person, dog person. I don't care. I love them both. So, all right. Active domain controllers. When you set up an active domain controller, active directory domain controller, it will turn on the NTP server features automatically. You don't actually have to change it from client to server. By making that a domain controller, it becomes an NTP server by default. Now, within the domain controllers synchronize with the primary domain controller, and the primary domain controllers will sync with their parent domain controller or with other domain controllers within the same domain. Clients will sync with their respective domain controller that they log into. Okay, so clients, if there is no domain controller for them to sync the clocks to, will go back out to that timewindows.com default. Now, with everything else, we need to use secure communications. I mean, these are servers. So when we're doing remote access to these, we want to have them in secured communication channels. So use SSH, and this will set up command line interface control with the server, and we can remotely manage via the OpenSSH connection. And we use port 22. So we need to, again, modify our inbound firewall rule to allow TCP port 22 to connect. One of the things you should ensure when you're setting up Secure Shell as a feature is make sure the feature turns on automatically, so that when you remotely connect it, if the service isn't already running, it will start the service. So we basically connect via a PowerShell or command line prompt, and the syntax is SSH, then the username that we use to authenticate with, and then the @ symbol and either the host name or IP address of the server that we wish to connect to. The other way we can do remote connections is via remote desktop. So again, we've got to set up the server to accept remote connections. So we need to enable the remote desktop feature, server feature on the server. And then after turning on the feature set on the server, we can then connect to the server using the mstsc command and then desktop, and then we'll enter the host name, and it will prompt us for our user credentials to allow the connection to occur. So if we can do this in activity 3, remote access, we'll be laughing. That's basically where I've gotten to in that one. What comes next is setting up DHCP and DNS. Setting up the DNS ones are quite a few steps to setting up DNS fully. From memory, there's about 12 steps. Each of those steps have, if you're doing it through the GUI interfaces, take another like 10 or 12 steps per instance through the menus. So depending on what you want to do, changes that a bit. Alright, so I've been yammering on for 45 minutes or so. So I'm going to end the recording there. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll go through the activities together.